I believed I understood scale before I was born into it. That is the lie every hive-born carries, like a birthmark burned into the soul. We grow up surrounded by walls so vast they blot out the idea of a horizon, by ceilings so high they turn clouds into rumors, and we mistake familiarity for comprehension. I thought the hive was a city once, something built for people, something that served us. Only later did I understand the truth. We are not citizens of the hive. We are its raw material. My earliest memories are not of faces, but of noise. The constant thunder of industry never stopped, never paused, never slept. Even in the deepest hours of the false night, when Lewin strips dimmed to a sickly amber and the hab-block corridors filled with the smell of recycled air and unwashed bodies, the hive still screamed. Conveyor chains clattered like distant gunfire. Plasma furnaces roared like caged gods. Somewhere far above, cargo haulers the size of cathedrals groaned as they shifted their impossible weight. The sound pressed into you, seeped into bone and thought, until silence itself became something terrifying, something unnatural. I was born in the mid-hive, which meant people above us called it a slum, and people below us called it paradise. Our hab unit was a steel coffin stacked among millions of others, bolted to a support strut that had been ancient before my great-grandparents learned to breathe. The walls sweated condensation and rust. The air cased it of metal filings and ozone. Every breath felt borrowed, filtered through kilometers of ducts clogged with grease, spores, and the dead skin of generations. We learned early not to ask where the air came from, or how much longer it would keep coming. The hive rose above us in layers without end, each level crushing the one beneath it with the accumulated weight of centuries. Spires speared upward toward a sky none of us would ever touch, where nobles dined beneath stained glass domes and artificial suns. Far below, levels fell away into darkness so complete it swallowed light itself, where the underhive bred things that no longer deserved human names. Between those extremes, people like me lived and labored and died, our lives measured not in years, but in shifts. From the moment I could stand, I was counted, not cherished, not taught, but tallied. The administratum clerk who recorded my existence never looked at my face, only at the data slate in his hand. A name was assigned, a work bracket predicted, a caloric allowance estimated. That was my baptism into the Imperium, a number entered into a system too vast to care if I ever drew breath again. Work came early. It always does. By the time I reached my 10th standard year, my hands were already scarred and my lungs burned with the ache that never truly leaves. I worked in a manufacturum processing line that refined scrap plasteel into standardized components for things I would never see assembled. We stood shoulder to shoulder for 18 hours a cycle, feeding raw material into machines that could crush a man into paste without slowing. The overseers walked the line with shock mauls and devotional texts, reminding us that diligence was prayer, that suffering was service, that to endure was to prove worthiness in the emperor's sight. People died around me with numbing regularity, a slip, a moment of inattention, a machine spirit angered by improper rites. The line never stopped. The body was dragged away, the blood hosed into a drain, and another worker stepped forward from the waiting pens. We did not mourn. Mourning took time, and time was theft. Food was a gray paste dispensed from communal nutrient taps, flavored differently depending on availability and tithing demands. Some cycles it tasted faintly of fungus, others of something chemical and bitter. Once, after a particularly productive quarter, we were issued protein blocks that rumor claimed were vat-grown groks. I ate mine slowly, reverently, as if savoring it might make the moment last. Hunger was the hive's most faithful companion. It taught obedience better than any sermon. Faith was everywhere, but never comforting. Shrines crowded every corridor, every transit junction, every work floor. Candles guttered beneath images of a thousand-faced emperor, warrior, king, martyr, skull. We prayed because we were told to, because prayer was mandatory, because failure to kneel marked you as deviant. The ecclesiarchy priests spoke of his love in voices amplified by cracked vox grills, but their eyes were always scanning the crowd, watching for hesitation, for doubt, for the slightest delay in response. Faith in the hive was not a refuge. It was another mechanism, another gear in the machine. There were days when the hive shook, when alarms wailed and bulkheads sealed with teeth-rattling force. Sometimes it was an industrial accident cascading out of control. Sometimes it was civil unrest, a riot sparked by a missed ration shipment or a rumor of favoritism toward an upper level. Once, when I was 16, the tremors came from above, and we later learned an entire Hab district had collapsed. Its supports finally surrendering after millennia of neglect. Millions died in seconds. The official notice praised the Emperor's mercy for sparing the rest of the hive and announced revised labor quotas to compensate for the loss. I remember the Arbites patrols most clearly. They moved through our levels like predators, black armor gleaming beneath harsh lumen light, shotguns held with casual certainty. When they came, people pressed themselves flat against walls, eyes downcast, breath held. Guilt was assumed, innocence was irrelevant. I saw a man beaten to death for failing to produce identification quickly enough. I saw a woman dragged away screaming because her work record showed a pattern of underperformance. The law was absolute, and it was enforced not to protect us, but to remind us how easily we could be erased. Violence seeped into everything. Gangs formed in the shadowed corridors, marking territory with sigils carved into flesh and steel. They fought over ration taps, over scrap, over the right to exist 1 meter closer to a ventilation outlet that still functioned. I learned to move quickly, to keep my back to walls, to never look like I had something worth taking. Even so, I was stabbed once for my boots. I survived because the blade missed anything vital, and because infection had not yet claimed me. I thank the Emperor for that mercy, because that is what you are taught to do. Above us, the Spireborn lived lives so distant they might as well have been myth. We heard stories passed down like forbidden scripture, of gardens with real soil, of water that fell from the sky, of food prepared for pleasure rather than efficiency. Once, during a maintenance shift near a cargo lift, I glimpsed the noble procession descending past our level, sealed behind armored glass. Their clothes were works of art. Their skin was unblemished. They did not look at us. I realized then that we were not even beneath their notice. We were beneath their awareness. Time blurred in the hive. Days merged into cycles, cycles into years. People aged quickly, their bodies breaking down under constant strain. Augmetics were common, not as enhancements, but as repairs. Crude metal limbs, bolted to shattered frames. Ocular replacements, flickering with cheap optics. If you were lucky, an injury earned you reassignment. If you were not, it earned you disposal. And always, always, there was the sense of being watched. Auspex arrays tracked movement. Data scribes recorded output. Somewhere far above and far beyond, administrators analyzed the flow of lives like numbers in a ledger. We were told the hive existed to serve the Imperium, that our labor fed the war effort, that every shell forged, every ration packed, every uniform stitched, brought humanity one step closer to survival in a hostile galaxy. It was almost convincing, until you realized how cheaply that service was purchased. I learned what true fear was the first time the siren sounded with a different pitch, a deeper, more urgent howl that vibrated through my chest. The Vox announcements crackled with prayers rather than instructions. The sky, such as it was, darkened as defense batteries activated. We were herded into shelters and told to remain calm, to trust in the Emperor's protection. Later, much later, I would understand that this was not reassurance, it was ritual. The attack never reached our level. It didn't have to. We felt the distant impacts, the muffled thunder of orbital fire, the subtle shift in gravity as something massive died above us. Casualty lists were posted weeks later, columns of names scrolling endlessly across data screens. I searched for faces I knew and found more than I expected. Production targets were adjusted. Life continued. That is what life is like inside a hive city. Not a single story, but an endless accumulation of them, stacked one atop another until individuality collapses under its own weight. You are born, you labor, you pray, you endure. If you are very lucky, you are noticed by the Imperium in a way that does not end with a corpse reclamation tag. If you are unlucky, you vanish into the machinery without leaving so much as a dent. I still live here. I still wake to the scream of industry and sleep beneath flickering lumen strips. I still feel the hive pressing down on me, kilometer by kilometer, level by level, a man-made mountain built from faith, fear, and human lives. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if it all stopped. If the machines fell silent and the lights went out. I think the hive would finally reveal its true nature then. Not as a city, but as a grave so vast it forgot it was ever meant to be anything else. I tell myself that survival is a kind of victory, even here, even now. That thought clings to me during the moments between sleep and waking, when the hive's noise fades just enough for memory to seep in. But survival in the hive is not triumph, it is inertia. It is the art of not falling through the cracks fast enough to be noticed. It is learning how to bend without breaking, how to accept that the walls will always be closer tomorrow than they were yesterday. As I grew older, the hive revealed more of itself to me, not out of kindness, but necessity. Labor assignments change as bodies wear out. By my third decade, my lungs were no longer suited to the manufactorum floor, so I was reassigned to maintenance crawls, narrow service arteries that threaded through the hive's interior like veins. There, in the spaces between spaces, I learned how fragile our world truly was. Power cables thicker than hab blocks pulsed with barely contained energy. Steam pipes leaked superheated vapor that could flay skin from bone in seconds. Entire districts depended on pressure seals and prayer to keep atmosphere from bleeding into vacuum or toxic depths below. It was in those crawl spaces that I first understood how old the hive really was. You could see it in the layers of repair over repair, in inscriptions etched by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. High Gothic gave way to low, low to symbols no longer taught. Some passages were sealed with adamantium plates stamped with warning sigils whose meanings had been lost, but whose threat was still respected. Even the overseers avoided those routes. The hive remembers things the Imperium has forgotten, and it keeps its secrets buried where only the desperate ever look. I met people there who had never seen a shrine, never heard a sanctioned sermon. They lived in maintenance warrens, born to families who existed only because it was easier to let them persist than to purge them. Their faith was practical, their prayers whispered to machines rather than gods. I envied them, briefly, until I saw how quickly deviation drew attention. One denunciation, one unlucky audit, and the arbits descended. Afterward, the crawl space felt emptier, quieter, as if it too understood loss. The underhive was spoken of in warnings and half-truths, a place parents invoked to frighten children into obedience. I saw it once by accident, when a lift malfunctioned and dropped far below its intended terminus. The doors opened onto darkness so complete my lumen pack struggled to cut through it. Shapes moved there, human ones, perhaps, but altered by radiation, by neglect, by generations without law or light. I did not linger. No one does. If they can help it. The underhive is what happens when the Imperium looks away for too long. Rumors travel faster than people in the hive. We heard of conscriptions, of whole levels emptied to feed the guards' endless hunger. Some spoke of it as an honor, a chance to see the stars, to die for the Emperor somewhere other than a factory floor. Others hid, bribed officials, falsified records. I watched transports depart, packed with men and women whose eyes were hollow with fear and something like hope. Few ever returned, and those who did were changed in ways the hive did not know how to accommodate. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when something like wonder broke through the grime. A parade honoring a victorious crusade, visible only as armored silhouettes marching along a distant spire, the thunder of Titan footsteps reverberating through the hive's bones as god machines passed overhead, their presence crushing and awe-inspiring all at once. During those times, people stopped, looked up, and felt small in a way that was almost comforting. It reminded us that there were forces even greater than the hive, that our suffering was part of something vast and terrible, and perhaps meaningful. But those moments always ended. The parade moved on, the Titans departed, the noise of industry reclaimed its dominion. Life resumed its relentless grind. Children were born into hab coffins. Old men collapsed at their stations. Names were struck from ledgers and replaced with new ones. The machine did not pause to acknowledge any of it. I am older now than I ever expected to be. My body is more metal than flesh in places. My hands trembling from nerve damage and fatigue. I know I will die here. Most of us do. Not in glory, not in battle, but quietly, efficiently, our remains rendered down and redistributed back into the system that consumed us. That is the final service the hive demands. And yet, when I walk the corridors and feel the vibration of millions of lives moving in grim synchrony, I understand why it endures. The hive is monstrous, yes, but it is also proof. Proof that humanity can survive anything, even itself. Layer upon layer of suffering and devotion, built into a structure so vast it challenges the heavens. We are crushed by it, shaped by it, erased by it, but we also sustain it with every breath we take. This is life inside a hive city. Not heroic, not noble, endlessly grinding, brutally indifferent, sustained by faith that is as much habit as belief. If you listen closely, beneath the roar of machinery and the echo of prayers, you can hear the truth humming through the walls. The hive does not care who you are. It only cares that you continue. I used to think that indifference was the hive's greatest cruelty. I was wrong. Indifference, at least, is honest. What truly breaks you is the illusion of care, the way the hive sometimes pretends to notice you, just long enough to remind you how replaceable you are. There came a cycle when my work designation changed again, not because of injury this time, but because of need. A data loom audit flagged my output history as reliably compliant, which in the language of the administratum meant I was unlikely to question orders and statistically unlikely to flee. That was how I was selected for civic labor. That was how I learned what it meant to serve the hive directly, rather than merely feed its machines. Civic labor meant sanitation, corpse processing, infrastructure clearing after unrest. It meant being sent where the damage was worst and the oversight thinnest. We wore sealed suits that never quite sealed properly, rebreathers that filtered just enough poison from the air to keep us functional. We worked with tools designed for speed, not mercy. When hab blocks collapsed or gang wars burned through entire districts, it was us who went in after, cutting through twisted metal and broken bodies, sorting the living from the dead with practiced efficiency. The first time I handled a corpse reclamation tag, my hands shook. The tag was a simple thing, stamped plastic with a rune for organic matter, a number for processing priority. I learned quickly where to attach it, how to avoid looking at faces. Some bodies were so damaged, there was nothing left to recognize as human, and those were easier. Others looked as though they were sleeping, skin gray, eyes half-lidded. Those stayed with me longer. The Emperor forgives, the priest told us. The hive recycles. It was during those assignments that I saw how thin the line truly was between order and chaos. One missed ration shipment, one corrupt official exposed, one rumor whispered too loudly, and entire levels ignited. Fires raged unchecked, fed by promethium leaks and decades of neglect. The air filled with screams, smoke, and the crack of stub guns. Arbite's suppression teams arrived eventually. Always eventually. Their arrival marked by the thunder of shock grenades and the echoing commands to disperse or die. By the time order was restored, there was always less of the hive left than before, and somehow more work to be done. I stopped asking questions after I was ordered to clear a shrine. It had been a small thing once, a devotional alcove carved into a transit junction wall, tended by locals who pooled their meager resources to keep candles lit and icons polished. During a riot, it became a rally point. During suppression, it became a liability. The order came down without explanation. Remove it. Sanitize the area. Restore traffic flow. We pried Aquilas from the wall, shattered statues with powered mauls, swept ashes and bone fragments into collection bins. I expected to feel guilt or fear of divine retribution. I felt nothing. That frightened me more than any sermon ever had. The hive teaches you that even faith is conditional. There were times when the sky was visible, if only barely. On the highest maintenance platforms, during rare external assignments, I would look up through layers of smog and void shields and see a dull, sickly glow where the sun should have been. It never felt real. The sky was just another ceiling, higher than most, but still part of the same prison. I wondered what it would be like to stand somewhere the hive did not press down on you, where the air was not measured and the light was not rationed. The thought felt dangerous. I buried it quickly. Children grew up fast here, or they did not grow up at all. I saw them working lines beside their parents, small hands feeding machines that did not care how young they were. I saw them scavenging scrap in places adults avoided, quick and feral, learning violence as a second language. Occasionally, one would be noticed by the Schola Progenium recruiters, or the enforcers, taken away for a different kind of life. We spoke of those children in hushed tones, half envy, half dread. The hive does not give without taking more in return. As decades passed, I began to recognize a truth that no one ever said aloud. The hive is not failing. It is working exactly as intended. It produces soldiers, laborers, raw materials, and corpses in quantities that keep the Imperium alive. The suffering is not a flaw. It is a feature. Pain is efficient. Desperation is productive. Hope, carefully rationed, keeps the wheels turning. I sometimes think about the spire-born nobles, about whether they understand what rests beneath their polished floors. Do they hear us, faintly, through kilometers of stone and steel? Do they know that their comfort is built on an ocean of lives ground down into obedience? Or do they, like us, accept the world they inherited and call it natural? There are nights when the hive grows almost quiet, when maintenance cycles align and the machinery's roar dips to a low, constant hum. In those moments, lying in my hab unit with its flickering lumen and rattling vents, I can almost imagine the hive breathing. In, out. Millions of lives drawn in, expended, replaced. It is a comforting thought, in a way. It means my suffering is not unique. It means I am part of something vast and enduring, even if that something would never notice my absence. If you ask what life is like inside a hive city, this is the answer you are rarely given. It is not just misery, it is normalization. You adapt, you accept. You stop imagining alternatives because imagination is a luxury the hive cannot afford to grant you. You learn to find meaning in endurance, pride in compliance, solace in the simple fact that you are still here, until one day you are not. I used to believe that when the end came, I would recognize it, that there would be a moment of clarity, some final understanding granted as a reward for enduring so long. The hive cures you of that belief, as thoroughly as it cures you of hope. The end does not announce itself here. It arrives quietly, buried beneath routine, disguised as another order, another shift, another obligation you no longer have the strength to question. Age does strange things in the hive. It is not marked by celebration, but by subtraction. First, strength leaves you, then speed, then usefulness. The administratum does not care how long you have served, only how efficiently you continue to do so. I felt the shift before it was recorded. Tasks reassigned to younger workers. Supervisors no longer bothering to correct my posture or pace. When your mistakes stop being punished, it means you are already being written off. I was transferred again, this time to census support, a clerical annex attached to the Departamento Munitorum. It was quieter there, but no less oppressive. Endless rows of data terminals hummed beneath flickering lumen globes. We processed lives the way manufactorums processed ore, reducing men and women to lines of text, probabilities, deployment projections. Births, deaths, injuries, compliance ratings. Every entry fed the war machine. Every correction tightened its grip. That was where I learned how many hives there truly were. Tens of thousands across the Imperium. Each one a mountain of humanity. Each one convinced in its own way that its suffering was unique. I saw casualty projections that dwarfed our entire population. Entire worlds marked for expenditure with the same casual notation used for lost equipment. It was comforting, in a bleak sense. It meant the hive was not singling us out. We were simply part of a pattern too vast to feel personal. Sometimes guardsmen passed through the annex on their way to embarkation. Fresh uniforms, eyes sharp with fear and anticipation. Many of them were hive-born like me, though they stood a little straighter, breathed a little freer, knowing they were leaving this place behind. I wondered if they understood what awaited them. I wondered if I should warn them. I never did. What would I have said? That the galaxy beyond the hive is worse, but at least it kills you faster. The days blurred together more than ever then. I marked time by system updates, by the slow decay of my own body reflected in Medicaid reports I processed for others. There was a strange intimacy in handling records of death. I knew where people ended before their families were notified. I knew which injuries were survivable, and which were merely prolonged executions. The Emperor protects, the file said. The Emperor allocates. I dreamed more as I grew weaker. Not dreams of escape or rebellion, but of corridors I had never walked, of levels that did not exist on any official schematic. In those dreams, the hive was quieter, older, aware. I would walk through halls lined with skulls fused into the walls, each one whispering fragments of lives that had passed through this place. Sometimes I woke convinced I could still hear them beneath the hum of machinery. Sometimes I wished I could. The final reassignment came without ceremony. My output efficiency had fallen below acceptable thresholds. I was deemed no longer fit for cognitive labor. The recommendation was clear: auxiliary service, low priority. I signed the acknowledgement with hands that shook more than they used to, and no one noticed. Auxiliary service meant waste reclamation. It meant descending again, deeper than I had been in decades, into levels where the hive shed what it no longer needed. Slag pits glowed with chemical fire. Rivers of runoff flowed through open channels, carrying things best left unnamed. The air burned even through rebreathers. This was where broken machinery ended, where failed experiments were quietly disposed of, where people like me were sent when the system had extracted everything else of value. I worked until my body failed me. There was no dramatic collapse, no final speech. I slipped on a slick of unknown origin, fell hard, felt something tear inside me. Pain flared, then dulled. My coworkers looked down at me with expressions I recognized well. Calculation, not concern. They called it in. A servitor trundled over, its vox monotone announcing a non-critical delay. I was moved aside so work could continue. As I lay there, staring up at a ceiling lost in smoke and shadow, I finally understood something I had avoided my entire life. The hive was never meant to be endured forever by any one person. It was designed to outlast us. I thought instead of the sound of the hive at night, of the way it never truly sleeps, of how my life had been one small vibration in its endless structure. If this account survives me, if these words are ever heard beyond the walls that shaped me, then let them stand as testimony. This is life inside a hive city. It is not a trial you pass, nor a burden you overcome. It is a condition, a constant, a grinding truth that shapes you until there is nothing left to shape. The hive will continue. It always does. I thought that would be the end of me. Most people would have been right. In the hive, being moved aside is usually the same as being erased, just slower. But the hive has a way of refusing even that mercy. It does not simply let you stop. It finds another use. However small, however cruel. I woke in a Medicaid bay that smelled of antiseptic, oil, and old blood. The light was harsh, unfiltered, stabbing straight into my eyes. For a moment I thought I had died and been dragged somewhere worse, but the pain told me otherwise. Pain is how the hive reassures you that you still belong to it. My chest was wrapped in synth fiber bandages. My side ached with a deep, grinding throb, and my left leg no longer responded the way it used to. A servitor hovered nearby, its flesh sagging around poorly integrated augmetics, its vox repeating litanies of recovery with no variation in tone. A robed functionary eventually appeared, glanced at my slate, and informed me I was unfit for return to active labor. The words should have frightened me. Instead, they left me numb. Unfit usually meant one of two things. disposal, or reassignment to something even lower on the ladder than waste reclamation. I was told, without ceremony, that I had been selected for localized civic duty. The phrase meant nothing to me then. I would learn. They transferred me to a hab sector near the edge of a decaying transit node, a place where the hive's internal arteries had narrowed and clogged over time. The lifts failed often. The lights flickered more than they stayed lit. This was where people ended up when they slipped through the bureaucratic cracks, but were still inconveniently alive. My duty was simple: watch, report, remain present. I was a warden, though no one used the word. I was there to make sure the level didn't destabilize further, to note unauthorized gatherings, structural failures, unusual sounds. I carried a Vox bead linked to a distant oversight station that I doubted anyone monitored closely. My presence alone was meant to be enough, a reminder that the hive still remembered this place, even if only barely. It was there that I truly saw the cost of life inside the hive, stripped of illusion and momentum. These people were not productive anymore. They were the worn, the sick, the damaged, former laborers with twisted spines, children born wrong from recycled air and poisoned water, old men whose augmetics had outlived their flesh. They moved slowly, spoke softly, conserved what little energy they had. The hive had squeezed them dry and left them here to fade. And yet, there was something different about this level, something unsettling. Without constant overseers, without the immediate pressure of quotas and shock malls, people changed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but subtly. They helped one another more, shared rations, kept watch over the worst of the leaks and faults together. Someone repaired a lumen strip without authorization and left it on permanently, bathing an entire corridor in steady, gentle light. It felt wrong. Not heretical exactly, but unnatural, like a wound that had begun to heal where healing was not permitted. I should have reported it. That was my duty. I did not. Instead, I listened. I listened to their stories, to the fragments of lives shaped and broken by the same city that had shaped and broken me. Everyone here had once believed the same things I had, that obedience would be rewarded, that endurance meant something, that faith was noticed. Here, stripped of those illusions, they spoke quietly, carefully, but honestly. No one talked of rebellion. That was another lie the hive taught, that misery naturally led to uprising. Most people here were too tired, too damaged, too aware of the consequences. What they wanted was smaller: stability, time, the chance to exist without being crushed harder tomorrow than they were today. I realized then that the hive feared this more than riots or heresy. Not violence, but stagnation. Not hatred, but people simply remaining. Lives no longer accelerating toward exhaustion and replacement. A pocket of humanity that refused to burn fast enough. The order came eventually. It always does. Structural review. Resource inefficiency. Population non-compliance risk. The words arrived over my vox in a voice stripped of inflection. The level was to be cleared. Residents relocated. The transit node sealed and repurposed. I was instructed to ensure cooperation until enforcement arrived. I stood there for a long time after the transmission ended, staring at the rusted walls, listening to the distant hum of the hive beyond this pocket of quiet. I thought of every shift I had worked, every corpse I had tagged, every lie I had swallowed because it was easier than choking on the truth. When the enforcement teams arrived, I did not raise the alarm. I did not guide them efficiently through the level. I did not shout warnings, but I did not stop what happened either. I simply stepped aside and watched as people were herded, shocked, beaten, loaded onto transports bound for places worse than this forgotten corner. The lumen strip was smashed. The corridor fell back into shadow. They never asked me why compliance had been slow. My record already explained everything they needed to know. Old, damaged, low priority. I was background noise. Afterward, the level was silent. Truly silent. No voices, no footsteps. Just the distant breathing of the hive, flowing around this dead space like water around a stone. I remained there, because no one told me to leave. That is another truth of the hive. Sometimes it forgets you not because you matter too little, but but because correcting the mistake costs more effort than letting it stand. I became part of the structure, a living remnant wedged into a forgotten place. I watched dust settle. I listened to pipes creak. I felt the vibration of millions of lives passing elsewhere, unaware of me. If you ask what life is like inside a hive city, understand this: it does not end cleanly. It does not grant closure. It erodes you until you are a shadow watching other shadows. Until your existence is a footnote even the system no longer bothers to erase. And still, the hive continues. I lost track of how long I stayed there after that. Time in the hive only has meaning when someone is measuring it. And no one was measuring me anymore. My vox went silent first, its charge dwindling until it became nothing more than a piece of metal pressed against my ear. Then the lumen strips failed one by one, until I learned to navigate the corridors by memory and by the faint glow leaking through cracks from levels that still mattered. Hunger returned, slower this time, less urgent than it had been in my youth, but more persistent. I scavenged what I could from abandoned habs, ration packs left behind in haste, water condensers still dripping recycled moisture into cracked basins. I learned which systems still functioned intermittently, which vents carried air that would not burn my lungs. Survival became small again, personal, stripped of quotas and sermons. In a way, it felt closer to honesty than anything I had known before.
The hive did not punish me for this. It did not reward me either. It simply allowed it, the way it allows corrosion to eat through a support strut until collapse becomes inevitable, but not yet inconvenient. I realized then that the hive is patient beyond comprehension. It can wait centuries for a mistake to matter. Sometimes voices echoed through the sealed level. Not real voices, not truly. Sound carries strangely through the hive's bones. A laugh from far above, distorted and stretched until it sounded like grief. A prayer recited somewhere below, broken by static and distance until it became meaningless noise. Once, I heard singing, thin and wavering, a hymn I half recognized from my childhood. I sat against the wall and listened until it faded, unsure whether it had ever been there at all. I began to talk to the hive then, not in prayer, not in defiance, just conversation, one-sided and quiet. I told it about my life, about the manufactorum floor, the crawl spaces, the waste pits, the forgotten level that almost learned how to be human again. I don't know why I did it. Perhaps I needed a witness, even an indifferent one. Perhaps I had finally accepted what the ecclesiarchy never quite said aloud, that the emperor's realm listens without answering, and that is all it has ever promised. There were moments when I considered leaving, trying to make my way upward or downward, re-entering the flow of the hive, where people still had names and schedules and punishments. But I knew how that would end. I would be noticed again, assessed, processed. I would become useful just long enough to be used up completely. Here, forgotten, I at least belonged to myself in the smallest possible way. My body continued to fail, piece by piece. The injured leg stiffened until walking became a slow, deliberate act. My vision blurred, colors bleeding into one another beneath dim light. I could feel my heart laboring, each beat an effort rather than a given. None of it felt dramatic. There was no sense of approaching climax, just gradual decline, like rust spreading across a surface no one maintains anymore. One day, if days can still be said to exist, I felt the hive shift in a way I had not felt before. A deep tremor, not violent, but decisive. Systems rerouted, power surged elsewhere. This level, my level, finally fell below the threshold of relevance. The air grew thinner. The temperature dropped. Somewhere far away, a notation was made, a minor adjustment in a planetary schematic. Decommissioned, non-essential. I lay down then, not because I chose to die, but because standing no longer served a purpose. The floor was cold, the wall pressed solid against my back. I listened to the sound of the hive one last time, to the endless labor of humanity carried out without pause or reflection. I thought of all the people still moving through it, still believing, still enduring, still convincing themselves that survival meant something more than delay. If there is a lesson in my life, it is not one the Imperium would approve of. Life inside a hive city does not make you strong. It makes you accustomed. It teaches you how much can be taken before you stop resisting. how little you truly need to keep going, how easily meaning can be replaced with routine. The hive does not hate you. It does not even know you. It simply exists, a monument to humanity's refusal to die and its willingness to sacrifice anything else to prove it. I was born into it. I worked for it. I was consumed by it in pieces so small no one ever noticed they were missing. Somewhere above, the machines still roar. Somewhere below, something stirs in the dark. Between them, lives continue to flicker on and off like failing lumen strips, each one convinced, for a time, that it matters. This is life inside a hive city. The hive shifted around me, indifferent, immense, eternal. I could feel its weight even in the quietest moments, a pressure not just on the body, but on thought itself. Hallways stretched for kilometers without end, yet somehow always ended in more corridors, more habs, more arteries of metal and stone and steel that had never known sunlight. I walked among the shadows and the echoes, tracing patterns in the hum of machinery, feeling the pulse of millions of lives flowing overhead and beneath me, lives I would never touch but whose rhythm defined my own. I began to notice details others ignored, the faint scent of ozone near a malfunctioning generator, the subtle vibrations in the floor that signaled structural stress in a section miles away, the way the air moved through a blocked vent, carrying whispers of a conversation that had happened moments or perhaps hours ago. Every signal mattered, every imperfection was a lesson. In the hive, nothing is too small to be consequential. Sometimes I encountered those who had been here longer than I had, older than most records suggested. Their eyes carried the memory of decades, perhaps centuries, though most would never survive long enough for that to be counted. They spoke little, but when they did, it was in fragments of dialects lost to standardization, a jumble of devotion and vulgarity and technical jargon. I learned from them how to read the hive in ways that data and Vox reports could never teach. I learned where collapse would come first, which supports were already bending, which levels could be neglected for cycles without consequence. I learned that the hive was alive in a way that did not care about life. I came to understand the Arbites more intimately than I had as a young laborer. Enforcement in the hive is not about justice. It is about teaching the structure itself that its children are disposable, that obedience is not an aspiration but a requirement. I watched their patrols pass through, boots striking metal floors in perfect, rhythmic cadence. When a riot broke out or a gang fought for territory in the shadowed corridors, they arrived not with hope or mercy, but with procedures, shock mauls, flamers, suppression grids, and a cold, absolute efficiency that left no one unscarred. Survival was always measured, but never assured. I saw faith up close too. The shrines and altars carved into walls where space allowed, candles guttering weakly beneath flickering lumens. The priests, their robes patched and scorched from centuries of maintenance and ritual, moved among the hab blocks like ghosts, offering sermons into Vox grids that carried their words to countless ears, yet never reached hearts untouched by desperation. Faith was a currency, traded in compliance and obedience, measured in whispered litanies and the efficiency of labor. Many prayed because they feared punishment. Some prayed because they had forgotten they could do anything else. I prayed too, sometimes, though it was habit more than devotion, and I felt the difference.
Then there was the underhive, the part of the city no record acknowledges. I had glimpsed it once as a child, slipped down a maintenance shaft long abandoned. And I remembered the suffocating dark, the air thick with decay, the shadows that moved like they were alive. The underhive is the hive's secret, its error margin, its safety valve. Gangs flourish there, creatures altered by radiation and neglect, mutants that crawl and scuttle and bite. No overseer ever enters willingly. No law reaches far enough. Yet the underhive produces its own economy, its own rules, its own way of keeping the whole above it alive, paradoxically by resisting it entirely. I watched once as a small group fought over a scavenged oxygen extractor. A battle of tooth, claw, and crude fire, and I understood that life, even here, is not a gift, but a currency paid in full every hour.
I spent decades learning these truths, not through study, but through observation, through living, through being forced into situations where forgetting was impossible. I watched entire levels vanish due to structural failure, workers buried under tons of concrete and metal, and the system simply recalibrated quotas to account for the loss. I saw the same happen when disease struck, or fire, or Arbites intervention. The hive does not mourn, it does not pause, it absorbs, recalculates, continues. The emperor's name is invoked constantly, but it is the hive itself that governs the rhythm of suffering. Food became ritual, even when it was barely food. Nutrient blocks were measured in grams, delivered by conveyors at precise intervals, their flavor varying only according to supply shortages. I learned to savor the small variations, the tiny changes that marked a shift in tithing or production efficiency. Hunger was a constant companion, a teacher, a reminder that existence here was never guaranteed. Sharing even the smallest morsel was a decision of both charity and danger. To help someone could mark you as a potential deviant, a risk to be monitored. Then came the nights of silence. Not true silence, for the hive never truly rests, but temporary lapses where machinery faltered or processes paused, where the roar of production dipped low enough for my ears to pick up subtle details. The creak of an overburdened strut, the whisper of airflow through a fractured duct, the faint shuffle of scavengers beneath a grated floor. Those nights were dangerous and precious. Dangerous because the stillness often preceded disaster, structural collapse, Arbites sweep, gang raid, and precious because in that brief space, one could remember oneself, could feel the illusion of breathing alone. I learned the rituals of escape that did not exist. How to move through corridors without triggering alarm sensors. How to time ventilation shaft climbs to avoid detection. How to use darkness as both shield and guide. None of it mattered in the end. The hive sees, even when it does not act. It records, even when no one audits. And eventually, it claims. I understood mortality in a new way, not as an abstract fear, but as a process, gradual, measurable, unavoidable. Limbs fail, organs falter, senses dull. The body becomes a liability. When you are young, the hive gives you purpose. When you are old, it gives you calculation. And when you are useless, it reclaims what it can, leaving only echoes for the rest of us to walk among. I walked the corridors, a ghost among living shadows. I passed hab blocks, where children learned to work as soon as they could crawl. I passed manufactorums, where machines devoured scrap with more care than human lives. I passed shrines where priests whispered prayers to systems that would never answer. I passed the underhive, where the broken clawed at one another for scraps, and I knew this was the totality of existence. Endless cycles of labor, survival, compliance, and replacement, layered upon layers, each generation crushed beneath the one above.
And yet, despite all this, life persisted. Not nobly, not heroically, not gloriously, but persist it did. Inhabitants of the hive continued to work, to pray, to argue, to scavenge, to breed, to survive in ways both small and terrifying. They endured because they must. They endured because they are made to endure. They endured because the hive has no other design for them. I finally realized that the hive itself is not evil. It is indifferent. It is a structure built to last. To consume, to process, to produce, without regard to comfort, morality, or individual meaning. Humans here are components, gears, fuel. We are both alive and expendable, our suffering cataloged, our labor monetized, our deaths predicted and accounted for. And yet, for all its ruthlessness, for all its oppression, it allows existence. That, in a galaxy of xenos, heresy, and warp-born calamity, is perhaps its own form of mercy. I do not know how long I will remain. Perhaps days, perhaps years, perhaps until the hive finally reclaims this forgotten corridor, this ignored hab block, this decaying nerve of metal and stone. I do not fear it. I only observe. I am witness. I am the record. I am the pulse in the forgotten veins of a city too vast to be held in thought, too immense to be comprehended fully by any one mind.
This is life inside a hive city, endless, merciless, grim, and yet astonishing in its persistence. I endure because it endures, and it endures because humanity cannot stop, even when it has no reason to continue. The longer I remained, the more I understood that the hive does not merely shape bodies and habits, it reshapes memory itself. The past becomes unreliable here. Years compress, faces blur. Even trauma dulls into something functional, a tool rather than a wound. I would try to recall the exact sound of my mother's voice, the way she spoke my name, before it was reduced to a data entry, and I could not. I could remember the hiss of steam valves, the clank of conveyor chains, the monotonous chant of shift prayers with perfect clarity, but not her face. The hive decides what is worth preserving, and it favors what keeps you useful. I moved less as time went on, not because I could not walk, but because movement itself felt unnecessary. The hive came to me. Vibrations through the walls told me when production spiked elsewhere. A subtle warmth in the floor told me when power was being rerouted. I could sense Arbite's patrols before I heard them, could tell when a distant riot was about to ignite by the way the air pressure changed in the ducts. I had become attuned to the city in ways no overseer ever would. If I had been younger, healthier, this awareness might have been exploited, formalized, turned into another role, but I was already past that threshold. Insight, like compassion, is only valued when it can be weaponized. Sometimes I thought about the stars, not with longing, exactly, but curiosity. I had seen pits in sanctioned data slates, fleets blotting out suns, worlds burning under orbital fire, vast armies clashing in mud and ash for reasons distilled down to a few lines of high Gothic justification. The Imperium spans the galaxy, they say, 1,000,000 worlds bound together by faith and force, and yet here I was, my entire universe confined to a few kilometers of rusting corridors. I wondered how many other hives were like this, how many lives unfolded in almost identical misery, never intersecting, never acknowledged. Humanity spread across the stars, and still most of us never saw the sky. The idea should have been inspiring. It wasn't. I thought of the Guard again, of those transports full of hive-born men and women shipped off to die elsewhere. At least their suffering was mobile. At least their deaths would be recorded as casualties of war, honored in some distant ledger. Mine would not even merit that. I would simply cease, absorbed back into the structure like moisture into stone. There is a strange envy in that realization, an envy so quiet it barely feels like emotion at all. Once, I heard thunder that did not belong to the hive, a deep, resonant impact that rippled through the levels, different from industrial tremors or structural shifts. Orbital fire, perhaps, or the footfall of something immense. The hive reacted instantly. Bulkheads sealed, power grids rebalanced, Vox traffic surged, then stabilized. Whatever had happened, it had already been accounted for. I imagined Titans striding somewhere far above, god machines walking to war, their crews praying inside armored wombs while entire districts were evacuated or sacrificed to clear their path. I wondered if they felt the hive beneath them the way I did, or if to them it was just another surface to be crushed. I never saw them, of course I didn't. The hive does not show you its gods unless it wants something from you. As my strength continued to fade, my thoughts turned less toward the future and more toward patterns. I began to see my life not as a sequence of events, but as a curve, a predictable arc mirrored by billions before me and billions yet to come. Birth into noise, labor into exhaustion, utility into obsolescence. It was not tragic in the way stories want tragedy to be. It was mundane, reliable, efficient. The true horror of the hive is not that it kills you, but that it makes your death feel appropriate. I thought again of that forgotten level, the one that almost learned how to be human. The shared rations, the repaired lumen strip, the quiet understanding between people who had nothing left to lose but time. That memory lingered longer than most, perhaps because it represented something the hive could not tolerate: stability without exploitation, existence without acceleration, a life not optimized for output.
It was never going to be allowed to persist. I understood that now with absolute clarity. The hive requires friction. Without it, the machine slows. My breathing became shallow. Each breath felt like a negotiation, a request that might be denied at any moment. I did not panic. Panic requires energy. I simply listened, letting the sounds of the hive wash over me one last time. The distant roar of manufacturums, the faint crackle of Vox prayers bleeding through sealed bulkheads, the endless, comforting, terrifying proof that humanity was still grinding forward somewhere, regardless of me. If there is anything I want remembered, it is not my name. Names are temporary. It is not my suffering. There is too much of that already. It is this understanding that life inside a hive city is not lived, it is expended, carefully, deliberately, at scale. It is the price humanity pays to remain dominant in a galaxy that would happily erase us otherwise. And we pay it willingly. Because most of us never see an alternative. My eyes closed more often than they opened. When they did open, the light seemed softer, more distant, as if the hive itself were receding. I felt no divine presence, no revelation, no absolution. Just the slow, steady fading of sensation, like machinery powering down, one system at a time. Above me, below me, around me, the hive continued. It always will, long after my bones are dust sealed into its walls. Long after my thoughts have evaporated into nothing, it will still rise, still produce, still consume. New lives will be born into its noise and call it normal. They will believe, as I once did, that endurance is meaning. This is life inside a hive city, and it is enough.
And yet, even as that thought settled in me, I understood that enough was not the same as complete. The hive never allows completion. It allows only continuation, substitution, replacement. When one pulse fades, another rises to take its place. Indistinguishable, unremarkable, perfectly acceptable. I drifted in and out of awareness then, my mind loosening its grip on the present. Memories surfaced without order. The manufacturing floor returned to me. The heat shimmering above molten metal. The way the overseer's voice cut through the noise like a blade. I remembered the exact rhythm of the assembly line, how my hands moved without thought, how my body learned the motion until it felt older than memory itself. I remembered the first time I realized the line would keep moving, even if I fell into it, and how that knowledge changed something inside me forever. Other memories followed, the crawl spaces, cramped and humming with power, where I felt closer to the hive's heart than anywhere else. The underhive glimpse, that yawning darkness where humanity had slipped its leash and become something else. The forgotten level with the steady lumen light, the brief, dangerous feeling that life could be different if left alone long enough. Each memory rose, lingered, then dissolved, as if the hive itself were reviewing my existence and deciding what was worth retaining. There were moments when I thought I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Not Arbites, not workers. Something heavier, more purposeful. I imagined a Mechanicus delegation, red-robed figures moving through the darkness, their augmetics clicking softly as they assessed this abandoned sector. I imagined them scanning me with cold lenses, debating whether my remaining organic mass had any salvage value. The thought did not frighten me. If anything, it felt fitting. To be reduced at last to components, to be made useful again in some final, impersonal way. But no one came. The hive had already taken what it needed. My breath grew shallower still. Each inhale felt like drawing air through a filter clogged with years. My chest burned, then numbed. Sound began to stretch and distort, the omnipresent hum of the hive lowering in pitch until it felt less like noise and more like a vibration directly inside my skull. I wondered, distantly, if this was how the city experienced us in return, as fluctuations, as brief disturbances in an otherwise stable system. I thought of the Emperor then, not as a god on a golden throne, not as the stern visage staring down from a billion shrines, but as an idea, survival at any cost, unity enforced through necessity, a species so afraid of extinction that it built monuments of suffering and called them cities. I did not curse him, I did not praise him, I simply acknowledged that his Imperium worked, and that this was the proof. The hive did not collapse under its own weight. It did not drown in rebellion or rot away from neglect.
It endured. That endurance demanded fuel, and I had been part of that fuel. So had everyone I ever knew. There was a strange comfort in that symmetry. No one here was special, but no one was wasted either. Everything fed the machine eventually. My vision narrowed. The edges of the world darkened first. Then the center softened, like a lumen dimming before it fails. I could no longer feel the floor beneath me. Only the pressure of the wall at my back, and the faint vibration that told me the hive was still alive, still working, still uncaring.
If someone were to find this place in the future, if some survey team or archivist were to note this sealed level and wonder briefly what had been here before moving on, I doubt they would find anything remarkable. No shrine, no record, no marker. Just another forgotten cavity in a structure too large to fully map. That thought did not trouble me. It felt appropriate. I was born into the hive without consent. I lived within it without choice. I die within it without ceremony. That is not tragedy. That is design. The last thing I felt was not fear or regret or faith. It was recognition. Recognition that my life had followed its intended path with admirable efficiency, that I had fulfilled my function, that the hive would not even hiccup at my absence. Somewhere, far above, a child would be born into the noise and learn to breathe recycled air. Somewhere, a conveyor line would claim another inattentive worker. Somewhere, a priest would raise his voice in praise of the emperor's eternal domain. The cycle would continue, perfect and merciless. This is life inside a hive city, and it does not end, it simply replaces you. The hive does not mark the moment I stop breathing. There is no alarm, no notation sent upward through the data spines, no pause in production to acknowledge that one more unit has ceased functioning. My final breath leaves my lungs and vanishes into the recycled air, filtered, stripped, redistributed to someone who still has work to do. Even in death, nothing is wasted. The pressure in my chest fades. The pain goes with it. Sensation follows soon after. What remains is awareness thinning into something indistinct, like sound heard through too many layers of steel. The vibration of the hive is still there, constant and immense, but it no longer feels external. It feels distant, as though I am already being folded into it, molecule by molecule. I do not see visions. I do not hear angels. There is no judgment, no revelation waiting beyond the dark. The hive has no need for such things. It does not reward obedience with meaning. It rewards it with continuation. Somewhere above, machines still roar. Somewhere below, something howls in the dark. Somewhere between, billions live the same life I did, convinced, just long enough, that endurance is purpose and suffering is sacred. They will wake, labor, pray, and collapse into the same system that raised them, just as I have. Soon, maintenance will come, or scavengers, or nothing at all. My body will be processed, broken down, redistributed. The metal in my augmetics will reinforce a strut. The organic matter will be rendered into nutrient slurry. My bones may end up in the walls, fused into the hive itself, another unseen support holding the weight of the future. That is how the hive remembers you. Not by name, not by story, but by function. I was born into it. I served within it. I am absorbed by it. And the hive continues. That is life inside a hive city.